Good day, everyone. I am Dr. Archie Wright, the Executive Director of the Catholic Biblical Association. I want to welcome you to another live broadcast of the CBA Unbound Book Review Series, which features the latest releases of many of our CBA members. This morning, we have the honor of having a conversation about the latest volume by Dr. Hugo Mendez called The Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, and Purpose, published by Cambridge University Press, 2026. Our panel this morning for our discussion, Dr. Chris Skinner is a professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Loyola University, Chicago. Chris earned his PhD at Catholic University of America in 2008. He earned his THM in 2001 and a BS from East Carolina University. Chris is a scholar of New Testament and Christian origins, working at the intersection of narratology, narrative criticism, and historical criticism. He has authored multiple books, journal articles, and book chapters. His research explores literary and historical questions in the narratives about Jesus. Doctor in his family now, his daughter who just graduated and just got engaged too. So congratulations, Chris. Our second panelist, Dr. Sherri Brown, is Associate Professor of New Testament at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, where she has been a faculty member since 2014. She earned her PhD at Catholic University of America, with her work focused primarily on the Gospel of John. She earned a Master of Science in Social Work at Columbia University and a Master of Divinity at Yale University Divinity School. She has authored, co-authored, and co-edited 6 books, including Gift Upon Gift, Covenant Through Word in the Gospel of John, God's Promise, Covenant Relationship in John, Johannine Ethics, The Moral World of the Gospel, and the Epistles of John with Christopher Skinner, Interpreting the Gospel and the Letters of John, an Introduction, and Interpreting the New Testament, an Introduction, both with Francis J. Maloney. She has also published numerous articles, popular studies of the Johannine literature, as well as other texts of the New Testament. She is currently working on a monograph on the role of women in the Gospel of John called Apostles to the Apostles. Our third panelist, Dr. Alberto Simalano, is the Assistant Professor of New Testament at Santa Clara University, Jesuit School of Theology. He previously served as Assistant Tutor at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford, and earned both his MPhil and DPhil in New Testament Studies from the University of Oxford. Alberto's research centers on the development and reception of the New Testament, with communities understood the relationship to Jewish traditions and practices, as well as the questions surrounding when and to what extent the parting of the ways began to emerge. His aim is to contribute to ongoing scholarly discussions that illuminate the diverse religious practices of the first 2 centuries CE and the ways they shaped both Christian and Jewish identities. Our author today, Dr. Hugo Mendez, is our guest author for our UBR today. Hugo is the professor of religious at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Hugo earned his PhD from the University of Georgia in linguistics in 2013, along with his MA in religion in 2009. Hugo specializes in New Testament and its early reception, with particular interest in the literature attributed to the figures of John and the reception of biblical texts, figures, and images in late antiquity. Some of Hugo's latest publications include The Gospel of John, A New History, New York, Oxford University, 2025, and co-authored with Bart Ehrman, The New Testament, A Historical Introduction to Early Christian Writings by Oxford University Press, 2024. And of course, our UBR volume for today, The Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, and Purpose by Cambridge University Press, 2026. So welcome, Hugo. Welcome, panelists. We're looking forward to a vibrant discussion about Hugo's latest book, The Epistles of John. So first, Hugo will present a brief summary of the volume, and then we'll hear from each of our panelists. And at that point, we'll take a 5-minute break. And when we return, Hugo will have an opportunity to respond to the panelists, and we will then open it up for discussion. So Hugo, I hand it off to you now to give us a review of your volume. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Archie. And I just want to start by really thanking everyone who's here. First of all, Joshua, Archie, for putting on this event, the Catholic Biblical Association broadly for, a grant that very much had a great deal to do with actually making this book a reality. And I remain so profoundly grateful to the Catholic Biblical Association for that. All of you attending, especially the panelists who were so gracious to dedicate some time this morning and to read this book and respond to it, but all of you, Catholic epistles. It's always a New Testament. So my job today is to try to introduce you briefly to my book, The Epistles of John: Origins, Authorship, Purpose. I'm working on the assumption that none of you have read this book. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly through a PowerPoint that will basically outline the major interventions of the book to help you all have some basic stake and foothold in what we're going to be discussing over the next, 2 hours, right? So this is the title of the book. It was published with Cambridge this year, came out in January. So my book was designed as a one-volume resource on the Epistles of John. I really meant it to be a kind of book that would introduce the Epistles of John to a reader who potentially has never taken an interest in these texts. In the first place, it lays out the evidence for existing majority views on the epistles that I continue to uphold. This includes, for instance, their different authorship relative to the Gospel of John, the better known Gospel of John. I also, in the course of the book, lay out in great detail the arguments for the idea that there's literary borrowing in the collection. That, for instance, the epistle of First John is heavily dependent on the gospel, that Second John is dependent on First John. So all of that is there. But beyond tracing out these existing majority views in the field, this book is very much about making new interventions in the field, of trying to reframe the study of these texts. Specifically, my book challenges a dominant view in the scholarship on these texts, a view in which the epistles of John are all traced to a single first century Johannine community, and in which these epistles are all imagined as authentic texts, texts that were written very transparently by authors to audiences very directly who knew who these authors were. And what I argue in the book is that this view, as dominant as it is simply too narrow and too constrained in its imagination to accommodate all of the very complicated evidence that surfaces when we examine these epistles more closely. Instead, my book opens up other ways of understanding the origins, authorship, and purpose of the epistles. And as I develop my arguments, I especially press the case for the idea that the epistles are really a chain of second century pseudepigraphy written by three independent authors. That rather than concentrate all these in a single first century moment in geography, these are texts that represent a chain of second century works. The authors of these texts, and I do assign three authors to these texts, I argue may well have lived in different decades. They may have been active in different settings and participated in different Christian movements, or what we might term communities, beyond simply what has historically been reconstructed as a single Johannine community in some sort of intact, coherent way. So the scholarship that I do in this book builds on another book that just came out, The Gospel of John, A New History. That came out with Oxford in 2025. And essentially what this book does is it expands chapter 5 of that book into a full-fledged argument across a monograph length space. So I just want to briefly walk you through the chapters of the book so you understand the particular interventions that I'm making in each, and so that you perhaps have a little reference point if specific chapters are mentioned by the panelists in the next hour or so. In the very first chapter, Different Hands, I lay out the evidence that's widely accepted among scholars today that the Gospel and Epistles of John do not share a common author. That even though Christian memory and tradition identified all four works with the pen of John the son of Zebedee, that there have been great reasons for the past century that have led critical scholars to understand that the epistles do not seem to come from the same hand as the author of the gospel. In this chapter, for instance, I note the divergent reception histories of the epistles relative to the gospel. The fact that they each have a different circulation history as far as we can trace. They also have debates over their authenticity that are distinct from those that ever attended the gospel. First John was questioned by certain East Syriac authors. We definitely see Second and Third John heavily questioned from at least the 3rd century on. I also note the different ideas in these texts, different themes, different linguistic features that have led scholars to separate the epistles from the gospel. So this is all scholarship that has been out there for the better part of the last century. In chapter 2, A Family of Texts, I then take that forward to the next step. I lay out the evidence for literary borrowing in the collection. I argue that it's not merely that the epistles have different authors from the gospel, it's that they have different authors that in some ways seem to have known the gospel, seem to be heavily dependent on the gospel, and I also draw out evidence that suggests that these authors were dependent on one another. This chart on the left, which comes from page 55 of the book, is an example of the kind of, if you will, synoptic comparisons that I do in the work to really demonstrate the extent to which texts like 2nd John are really adapting the language and imagery, but very specifically the language verbatim of earlier Johannine texts. Much of this argumentation has existed in scholarship for last several decades, but I do press this argumentation further. Crucially, I demonstrate a line of dependence for these texts that would place all four texts in a certain genealogy, in a certain line of dependence, in the following order. I think that the Gospel of John was the first text that was written. I think 1st John was written adapt John, and that 3rd John was written last of all. Maybe to use the language of our friend James Barker, this is something of a snowballing trajectory of literary dependence. I'll put a shout out to James there. And in the process of doing this, I also argue for 4 authors in the entire Johannine collection. I argue that the author of the Gospel of John is distinct from the hand that wrote 1st John. The hand that wrote 2nd John is yet a 3rd person, and the author of 3rd John is yet a 4th person. And this is a very distinctive contribution in this book, but I think is well supported by the evidence for literary dependence in these works. Oh, here we go. In chapter 3, Disguised Authors, I move yet one more step. I argue that although the epistles had different authors, there is a reason why they share so many literary similarities to one another, why they have such thorough literary dependence on one another. Specifically, all of these texts share a common authorial pretense. As we know, ancient and medieval Christians today, have believed that the epistles of John were written by the same hand that wrote the Gospel of John. And I argue in this chapter that this is not an accident. This was a view that was planted in the texts themselves. All of the epistles present themselves as works by the same voice, the same hand that authored the Gospel of John. I argue in this chapter that there's a reason why, when one looks at the Gospel and one looks at the epistles, all of these texts consistently speak in an alternating we-I voice. Why multiple texts claim eyewitness experience for their author, why they reuse the same signature personal phrases, testimony is true, things that would suggest the idiolect, the individual linguistic fingerprint of the same author. I argue simply that the epistles of John were designed to look like works by the same hand that compose the Gospel of John. And as I note in this chapter, this indicates that these texts are pseudepigraphal, that these texts were written by later authors who were inhabiting the persona of the Gospel of John's author. And in calling these texts pseudepigraphal, I'm not making ultimately a very novel claim. The reality is that many ancient Christians suspected all of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, but especially the latter two texts, of being pseudepigraphal. What my work is doing is arguing that there are very sound reasons to take seriously the doubts that are attested by Origen, that are attested by authors like Eusebius, that are attested by later authors like Ishodad of Merv, that show that many, many segments of the Christian world had questioned the authenticity of these texts in antiquity. They are later pseudepigrapha. In chapter 4, Invented Situations, I challenged then the assumption that these four texts must have been written within a single Johannine community. This is a more complex chapter, but essentially I'm arguing that we have to be very cautious in how we use these texts in historical reconstruction, now that we understand that these texts may be pseudepigraphal, and that this necessarily has an impact on whether we can even construct a Johannine community at all. And what I develop over the course of this chapter is the idea that these texts may actually stem from authors who were located in different decades, probably of the 2nd century, in different potentially geographical, intellectual settings, and we need to open our imaginations far beyond the single Johannine community of scholarship. The final chapters of the book then ask a crucial question that the panelists be wrestling with today, which is how would this different view, new view, of the epistles as 2nd century pseudepigrapha change our interpretation of these texts? So much of the way that the epistles of John are approached today is very much as witnesses to an intact historical situation in the 1st century. How would thinking about them as pseudepigrapha alter how we would understand their origins and their purpose, their meaning, their interpretation, most especially? In part, I argue, it should lead us toward a deeper appreciation of their independent origins, purpose, and even message. We should begin to see multiple competing agendas in these texts. In chapter 5, A Treatise on Sinlessness, I argue that we need to recognize how distinctive 1 John is within the collection. By the way, if you're interested in reading any segment of this book, this month only, May 2026, Cambridge has made this chapter, chapter 5, which I consider to be kind of the keystone chapter of the book, available for free at this link. So please feel free to look up this link and download the chapter. Go on the Cambridge website, you'll find it there. In this chapter, I cast the epistle of 1 John as a treatise that's meant to introduce a distinctive sinless perfectionist view, one that's seen in various texts like 1 John 3:9, which says that those who have been born of God do not sin and cannot sin, or 1 John 5:18 that says that those who are born of God do not sin. I argue that we need to begin rethinking the message of 1 John around this repeated insistence on the unique, essentially, capabilities of those who are born of God, who have received the Spirit, extending ideas I think I see earlier in the Pauline corpus, but taking them to in further directions. So that chapter is available online if you'd like to sample it. Finally, in chapter 6, Quasi-Biographical Letters, I read 2nd and 3rd John as works that are caught up in a different kind of project. I see these letters as texts that are doing quasi-biographical work, creatively expanding the memory of John's eyewitness narrator. I note that this kind of quasi-biographical work is something that we find in other very brief, very mundane Greek pseudo-historical letters of the period. And I argue that these letters also seem to be engaged in other issues, such as clarifying the nature of Jesus, discussing how one should show or not show hospitality towards itinerants. I try to really understand the project of these texts. So, last in the epilogue, I discuss how all four texts came to be identified as works of John, the son of Zebedee, in particular. So, to close, my hope is that I've written a book that can be both a resource for the future study of these epistles, one that can be deployed in the classroom, but also a catalyst for new thinking on the epistles, one that can inspire new conversations around these texts. I'll leave it to the panelists then to discuss the merits of this project, but I, again, want to thank the CBA making this project possible, for hosting this event, and for all of you for joining me in this discussion today. Thank you.
Hugo, thank you for that. That was a great introduction to the volume and gave everybody a great foundation who hasn't read it. And I'm sure will help us understand what the panelists are going to say now. So we're going to turn to Chris, who's going to open up his discussion of the volume. So Chris, I turn it over to you now.
All right. Thanks, Archie, and thanks, Hugo, for that. And before I begin, I do want to point out that my doctor sister, Sherri Brown, is actually a full professor at Creighton. She was introduced as an associate professor, and it takes a lot of work to get to full professor, so we should always make sure we acknowledge that. So first, good morning to everyone. I'm thrilled to be a part of this session today. This is the third Unbound Book review I've been privileged to participate in, and I always find the experience first to be illuminating and really generative for my own thinking. And I'm, of course, always appreciative of the conversations that emerge. I'm equally happy to celebrate and interact with the work of Hugo Mendez, who is not only a colleague, but has also become a friend. In fact, in August, it will be 10 years since Hugo and I first met at the 2016 annual general meeting of the CBA on the campus of Santa Clara University. And during those 4 days, Hugo and I talked a great deal about life and family and Johannine scholarship, among other things. But a portion of our time was spent walking around campus searching for valuable Pokemon. I don't know if you remember this or not, Hugo, but Pokemon Go was in its infancy at the time, and this was something I was doing here in Chicago with my teenage boys. And I didn't realize how serious Hugo was about Pokemon Go. He and I were walking across campus, and there was this young undergrad who was searching for Pokemon. And I said to him, "Hey, I just saw a Charizard over there." I didn't. The guy freaked out. A Charizard? He's jumping around, I'm joshing, and Hugo gently steps in and says, "There's not a Charizard over there." And at that moment, I think Hugo probably thought I was a big jerk. But anyway, since that time, I've been consistently impressed with Hugo's scholarship, his collegiality, and his leadership in various groups such as the Connecting John unit of the SBL, the steering committee of the Johannine literature group of the SBL, in which we serve together, and the Gospel and Letters of John consultation of the CBA, in which we have both regularly participated. Another thing I have observed over the past decade is how Hugo has been able to generate genuinely substantive, one second, my pages are out of order here, genuinely substantive scholarship, while also engaging in lots of other public-facing work. In my opinion, there are not many in our field who are capable of doing both of these things quite so well. In the time that I have today, I want to spend a few moments reflecting on what I love about this book, and then raising a few questions before interacting with the specific questions that have been provided for us by those who have planned this event. I should begin by saying that I have had a front row seat to the development of a great deal of what ended up in this book. I have actually read and responded to, both formally and informally, multiple papers that became part of this book, and I have followed the various strands of Hugo's argument with great interest over the past several years. I was also happy to provide an endorsement for the volume, in which I laud its substance and imagination. While this present volume is certainly capable of standing on its own, I don't think we should read it or discuss it in isolation from Hugo's wider Johannine project, which includes, among other things, his 2020 JSNT article, "Did the Johannine Community Exist?", his 2025 monograph, The Gospel of John, A New History, published by Oxford University Press, and his recent article in Early Christianity, John as an Apocryphal Gospel. These articles and books exist in a symbiotic relationship to one another, and I do not think it is hyperbole to suggest that in a short span of time, Hugo has set an entirely new course for those involved in scholarship on the Johannine literature. I genuinely believe that when our current students are reflecting on the state of Johannine scholarship 20 years from now, the current work of Hugo Mendez will be spoken of in the ways we speak today of the pioneering work of scholars like Martin, Brown, Culpeper, and Reinhardt, just to name a few. Okay, so there's my encomium. Now to a few things that I really love about this volume. First, I'm deeply appreciative of the clarity of Hugo's writing. Much academic prose is clunky and filled with overly bloated syntax. This is something I spend a great deal of time and energy emphasizing when I am directing documentations. Our work as scholars can, at the same time, be technical and filled with the necessary academic jargon, while also being eminently readable. As a rule, I think that Hugo accomplishes this, and he certainly writes with such clarity in the current volume. And you should know, Hugo, this is not praise, the sort of praise that I give out easily, and I mean this sincerely. Second, the book's emphasis on the reception history of the epistles is a new angle that allows Hugo's argument to develop its own contours that move away from well-worn and some might say stale academic treatments of the evidence. I commend Hugo for pursuing this particular angle in the book. I believe it allows his argument to stand out from previous treatments of the Johannine letters. Third, this book, and really Hugo's larger project, has been receiving a lot of attention because of the novel conclusions he sets forward. But I also think it's important to point out that there's a lengthy interpretive section in this volume specifically devoted to 1 John. And when you engage this section, you discover that Hugo is also a judicious exegete who pays attention to the sort of textual details we emphasize with our students. He supports his theory of production with careful attention to the primary text, which is arguably the most important skill we teach and hopefully demonstrate in our work as biblical scholars and historians of the ancient world. Fourth and finally, Hugo's work, both in this volume and in the others I have referenced previously, is brimming with scholarly imagination. Again, reading so much academic writing is like trying to ingest a saltine cracker on top of Melba toast. Yes, it may have some substance, but it's often dry and difficult to choke down. By contrast, reading Hugo's scholarship is a delight. Even when I think he could be wrong, or when I think he's definitely wrong, I'm generally impressed by Hugo's combination of academic rigor and imaginative thinking. And in my mind, I call on recent conversations that I've had with people like James McGrath and Mark Goodacre, two others who are particularly good at this, on the importance of infusing our work with both rigor and imagination. Now, there's numerous other things about this book that I appreciate, but in the interest of time, let me raise a few concerns before returning to the two questions that have been posed to us as members of this panel. First, I'm not as convinced that the best analogs for thinking about our earliest Christian writings should be sought primarily from within the world of Greco-Roman compositional practices. I raised the same concern in my review of Robin Walsh's monograph a few years ago, and I've recently been in conversation with James Barker about this very issue, as he and Robin and Hugo are largely in agreement on this position. Now, Hugo is far from the only scholar in our field to move in this direction, but I wonder about this general trend in the field. My question/concern would be, what, if anything, do Jewish literature and its concomitant literary practices have to contribute to our discussions about these texts in particular and our earliest Christian writings in general? Second, given the brevity of two of the Johannine epistles, that's 2 John and 3 John, I simply do not know what the payoff would be in forging independently such short and seemingly insignificant letters. 2 John is roughly 258 words in Greek. 3 John is roughly 234 words in Greek. In my estimation, neither contributes much of substance on its own to the landscape of these early Christian teachings. This is an objection I've raised before, and I know Hugo likely has a ready response, but I'm not certain that I will be convinced by the answer given my exposure to his wider project, but I'm happy to have that conversation. Third, in light of how little both 2nd and 3rd John contribute, and again, this is my own take, I wonder if it's necessary to suggest three separate authors with zero connection to one another. In my endorsement for the volume, I mentioned that Hugo's argument has, quote, tremendous substance and explanatory power, end quote. That said, my sticking point might actually be connected to the explanatory power of the overall model. Now, don't get me wrong. This is not about the need to establish a connection to the same author. I am happy to traditional explanations for the authorship of the gospel and epistles, whether it be the son of Zebedee, the elder, or some other figure. I'm also fine with suggesting different authors for the epistles. I'm just not certain that they need to be postulated as being completely independent from one another. As an analog, in the same way we envision the Deutero-Pauline epistle to the Ephesians as having something of a genuine Pauline connection, and that is, it's been written by someone who seems to know and be sympathetic to Paul's thought, presents Paul's thoughts fairly faithfully, but wants to advance Paul's thought in light of development since his death. In that light, I wonder if it's possible to envision a scenario in which those responsible for the Johannine epistles, even if it be three separate authors, have some genuine connection to one another. Hugo may in fact be correct that each of the epistles has a different author, and I'm happy to consider that as a legitimate option. So maybe it's fair to say that I'm not averse to his conclusion about different authorship of the epistles, but perhaps not as comfortable in thinking about them as being as disconnected from one another as he argues. Okay, so again, we can talk about these things in the wider discussion if necessary. Let me pivot briefly to the two questions we have been given for consideration today. I was going to read them, but in interest of time, I know that they have been put in the chat. So a quick just summary. How would this change in perspective if we accept Hugo's view? How would this change in perspective shape our understanding of what the Johannine literature or Johannine tradition is? My instinct here is to say that our understanding of the Johannine literature or Johannine tradition would be virtually untouched. As I understand it, Hugo is not arguing that we should no longer regard this material as Johannine. For millennia, we have had disagreements over who wrote the gospel and epistles, and those disagreements have not fundamentally changed the way we think about this material as part of a wider Johannine tradition, the thorny question of whether or not to include the book of Revelation notwithstanding. Hugo's work is another in a long line of proposals that force us to rethink our perspectives on the Johannine literature, but not necessarily whether it should be considered Johannine. So here's where the second question comes in. Assuming that Hugo's hypothesis is true, how do the central themes shift in the Johannine literature? Now, I've already alluded to this in my earlier comments. If we accept Hugo's hypothesis, we are forced to set out on an entirely new trajectory in our treatment of Johannine themes, something he does well in his treatment of 1 John. If I'm searching for an analog that we are already familiar with, and one that I think works fairly well within contemporary New Testament scholarship, we might begin to see the study of the fourth gospel and its relationship to the epistles in the same way we envision the relationship between Paul's authentic letters and those deemed to be secondary. That is, one writing or set of writings is used to shed light on the others. The first reflects an established literary/theological achievement, while the others represent particular angles of reception, evolution, and/or advancement. I think we could see Hugo's work on the epistles as an argument already for unique receptions and/or advancements of Johannine theology, even if not all in the same direction. This might be a helpful path forward for thinking about the relationship between our Johannine text, though I'm eager to hear what my colleagues on the panel have to say in answer to this question. So as I close out my formal comments, I want to note that what Hugo has produced here is the sort of thing we should celebrate as historians, biblical scholars, and scholars of Judaism and early Christianity. It's the type of work that forces you to think, does not allow you to be comfortable with pat answers or simple appeals to the consensus, and most importantly, advances the field. I want to celebrate and this fine work and encourage those of you who have not read the book first to go buy it. Don't just check it out, buy it. Let's support Hugo's bottom line here. Let's engage its argument and make up your own minds. Hugo, congratulations on this important achievement in Johannine studies narrowly and biblical scholarship generally. You deserve to be proud of this work.
Chris, thank you so much. Those of you who are going to buy it, there is a 20% discount code in the chat somewhere. I don't know. It's rolling around in there somewhere. I can't see it at the moment, but Chris, you offer some great comments there for discussion. I'm sure that will give Hugo some things to think about along with our other panelists. And we're now going to turn to full Professor Sherri Brown. And Sherri, I apologize. I must have picked up an old clip from Creighton on your associate professor, but I do apologize for that. And welcome, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Archie. Yeah, now everybody knows like 5 times over my job title, so I think we're all clear now. So thank you, Archie and the CBA, for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion on the origins, authorship, and purpose of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. I also thank my co-panelists, Christopher Skinner and Alberto Simalano. Thank you, Chris, for starting our panel discussion so incisively. As Chris mentioned, we are doctor siblings and have a very similar background and take on this material. So you will see definitely some overlap in my discussion. Most importantly, thank you, Hugo, for both authoring and agreeing to share with us in this format such an interesting and exhaustively studied treatise on these 3 epistles. I agree with everything that Chris said about not only its novelty, but also its extensive research and readability. So I have very much enjoyed my time these past week or so engaging in this material. So thank you for that. And as Chris also mentioned, in the last decade, I have appreciated getting to know Hugo and do also consider you very much a friend. We've had some interesting adventures over the years at various conferences. I hope that continues and we can continue to debate these ad infinitum well into the future. As we've already established, the panelists have been charged not to present a book review as such, but to reflect upon 2 essential questions. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat them here. The first focuses on authorship. Hugo argues that the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John only present themselves as if they come from a single voice, while actually reflecting 3 different and probably unconnected authors. How would this change in perspective shape our understanding of what the Johannine literature or, quote, Johannine tradition is? And the second focuses on interpretation. Assuming the previous hypothesis is true, how do the central themes shift in the Johannine literature? As you might imagine, Hugo's work evokes so many thoughts, questions, ahas, and other responses that I find it difficult to focus on these 2 concerns. Nonetheless, I will do my best. I learned a great deal from part 1 of Hugo's manuscript, especially with regard to what can broadly be designated as falsely authored and or pseudo-historical works. Here, I very much appreciated Hugo's careful differentiation between different categories of these works, as alongside the exploration of them in the Greco-Roman literary world. That said, I have some questions. In his introduction, Hugo discusses and dispenses with the term pseudepigraphy for these epistles, and for good reason, I believe. The term refers to false inscription, a common general category of writings in the ancient world, and it is unlikely that any of the epistles initially bore a title of 1st, 2nd, or 3rd John. Further, the term also typically and somewhat problematically in its own right refers to a category of Jewish non-canonical writings. I agree with this. Hugo eventually seems to land, as is the title of one of his chapters, on the designation of disguised authorship for the epistles, with which I have a great deal of sympathy. However, the designation seems to fall away in future discussion of the Gospel and Epistles of John. Further, at one point, Hugo quotes a scholar, and as I went back to find it, I could not find it. So, Hugo, maybe you can remind me where this is, who indicates that pseudepigraphy was punishable in this period. But then Hugo goes on to use the term as I would, as we all do, as we saw in Hugo's own synopsis of his work. Instead of focusing on disguised authorship, Hugo later prefers terms like pseudepigraphical, false authorship, derivative composition, fictionalized historical settings and readers, and letters. These terms seem to be meant to provoke, not explain, and I question their usage and intent. It's a bit of a throwback, it seems to me, to early Enlightenment scholarship when all intents were to discredit any sincerity to the biblical text. Further, it seems to me to be wholly unnecessary to advance the exegetical theses presented in part 2 of the manuscript. But back to the questions asked. Let me give the caveat that although I read Hugo's volume carefully, I was only able to devote time to this project once my academic year was completed. This means that I did little to no exploration beyond Hugo's volume into the venues for research that he excites. I look forward to that in the future. Therefore, I don't find the, assertions of fictionalized authors of the gospel and 3 epistles convincing. They are certainly possible, but I don't find them any less speculative than the detailed historical communities and layers of composition posited by earlier scholars like Brown and more recently Van Balde and others. That said, I don't mind dispensing with these understandings of Johannine communities, churches, or circles, but I'm not sure what Hugo presents is entirely distinct from what other scholars have suggested in the past, or at least not as distinct as asserted in the volume. If there are 3 further authors using either the gospel or eventually 1 John as credible source material and context for their own teaching, aren't they somehow connected to the evangelists? Chris mentioned something along these lines as well. Hugo moves in that direction in the end, but only after disparaging and dispensing with any and all earlier propositions. There still seems to be some sort of Johannine teaching threading through the early centuries of the Christian tradition that gives sustenance to some authors who presumably live in a particular socio-faithful context for which their perspective is not foreign, such that they take up this mantle to write. Is this a Johannine tradition? Certainly not in the sense of the clear-cut community of churches in and around Asia Minor presented by some. Nonetheless, a tradition not unlike that outlined in the first verses of 1 John, such that even 100 or 200 years after the earthly life of Jesus and his disciples, however beloved, a Christian leader who fashions him or herself as the elder can appeal to this core to adapt it for their own context, time, and purposes. The second question upon which I was asked to reflect regarded how this hypothesis might shift my understanding of central Johannine themes. Here I will focus on 1 John, as Hugo indicates is the core of this study. As anyone who's read anything I've written about 1 John knows, early in my study, I was taken by the work of Edward Malatesta on 1 John. This has guided my own interpretation of the letter, which focuses on what the author has to teach about God and what it means to be a child of God. Generally speaking, I concur with Hugo's interpretation that this author understands the gospel to agree with their position and thus mines it for source material. Although, as I've said, I don't think this means that they are entirely removed from the evangelist and his context. Hugo, in contrast to my own hermeneutic, focuses on what the epistle author teaches about us, humans who believe, and how we might live sinlessly, walking in the light. I might go so far as to suggest that while my hermeneutic comes from above, Hugo's comes from below, and it is clear to me how his interpretation relates to my own and augments my own. I might suggest the reverse is also true. Theology feeds anthropology, and the impeccable life is facilitated by knowing God and what God has done for humankind in and through Jesus Christ. So, particular chapter, I think, is exceedingly valuable in advancing the discussion of First John, and I very much appreciated it on several letters. As a side note, I want to reiterate that I don't think it's necessary to fictionalize either the author or the suggested opponents of the author. However general, is a real issue in the 2nd century and ever such varied understandings of the person of Jesus are all the precursors to the Council of Nicaea and later developments of what Hugo seems to group under Proto-Catholicism. However, as Hugo rightly iterates and reiterates, focus on God's new commandment of believing that Jesus is the Christ and Son of God and loving one another. These themes are not shifted by any aspect of his hypothesis. He does, however, suggest new, expanding historical and geographical context for these themes. As a fan of Johannine spirituality, I am all for this, and I appreciate this work. Further, I want to thank Hugo for his discussion of the ancient context of shifting between I and we language and how this was common in compositions in an effort to blend testimony with general or communal understanding. This helps a great deal in understanding not only the opening verses of 1 John, but also the concluding verses of John 21. I also appreciate his discussion of the ancient pedagogical practice of composing letters in the guise of famous figures. Hugo suggests this practice could be the blueprint for 2nd and 3rd John. I'm not convinced that those letters' identification of their author as the elder clearly identifies them as letters in the guise of the Gospel of John or 1 John, but I did encounter a similar phenomenon in my own teaching that I'll share. Several years ago, I taught a class on Paul and his letters for Creighton's master's program in Christian spirituality in the Ignatian tradition. A component of this class was for the students to submit discussion posts that reflected on their assigned readings for each week. Although tentative at first, these students welcomed the task and the opportunities to reflect upon and question the readings. About halfway through the term, one student posted her reflective concern in the form of a Pauline letter. It was as insightful as it was funny. It was also contagious. Other students rose to the challenge and began to submit their own reflections, questions, concerns, and even corrections in the true Pauline sense, as they believed, based upon their intensive study, Paul would have done. I was amazed and encouraged it all. The more they did it, the more insightful they were, and the better responses from their colleagues they received. It was a lot of fun. I cannot help but see an analogy here to what Hugo suggests is the motive behind the Epistles of John, and how much more so in the literary context of the ancient world that he so expertly illustrates. It is, however, far more positive. I would not assess what my students did as derivative or fake. This was neither their intention nor how their compositions were received. However imperfect this analogy of my class is, their community formed with each addition to the discussion, and they continue to reference the formative value of that community today. I have to ask how such descriptive bricolage, to use one of Hugo's favorite terms, impacts our study and interpretation of the Gospel and Epistles of John. So I look forward to hearing what Hugo has to say about these questions and concerns, but I want to conclude by, again, iterating and reiterating how valuable I think this contribution to the larger discussion of the Johannine literature is, and how much as Chris indicated, that it becomes a standard in our scholarship and further research. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Hugo.
Thank you, Sherri. Again, you raised the point that this is a very valuable contribution, but you also have some really good questions for Hugo to bring to discussion, and we appreciate that. And now I want to turn to our third panelist, Alberto Simalano. Alberto, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Archie, and thank you, everyone. Perhaps allow me to begin with a personal word of appreciation for Hugo Mendez. At the 2024 Oxford Patristic Conference, there I was as a final year DPhil student trying to figure out what am I going to do, what happens next, not only as an aspiring academic, but as a father of 4 young children. And Hugo went out of his way to connect with me, generously offering his time, encouragement, and willingness to read over drafts and proposals and etc. And his kindness came exactly at the right moment for me. And so it was therefore a real pleasure to respond to his newest book. Hugo has produced, as we have heard already said multiple times, a truly remarkable work, not merely because of its productive thesis, but because it compels Johannine scholarship to revisit a relatively modern assumption of the Johannine community, that the explanatory power of the Johannine community hypothesis, and probe it and to question it. As we've heard it, and Hugo presented it, the book accomplishes this in broad terms through exegetical and reception historical analysis, arguing that Johannine epistles were written by different authors, each text consciously imitating earlier Johannine literature. And because these writings seek to sound like earlier authoritative voices, they should not primarily be read as windows into a historical community, but rather as literary constructs. Of course, whether one ultimately accepts all of Mendez's conclusion or not, this is a book the field will have to reckon with. So let me start with 3 major contributions of the volume as I see them, and then offer some questions for Hugo and the panel. So first, and this is surely correct, that the Johannine community has often functioned as an overly elastic explanatory construct. Too frequently, modern scholars have inferred a community from tensions within the text, and then used that reconstructed community to explain the very tensions from which it was inferred. Of course, this is not the first time Mendez has pressed Johannine scholars on this issue. Many of us have already benefited from his important 2020 JSNT's article, Did the Johannine Community Exist? Yet this volume, as it is the case of last year's book, significantly deepens and extends that methodological challenge. Indeed, one might be tempted to say, as a student of mine said on Monday's class on John, hey, I think what Hugo is doing to the Johannine community is what people like Mark Goodacre are doing to Q. And I said, yeah, kind of. For readers persuaded by his cumulative case, the traditional appeal to a reconstructed Johannine community begins to look increasingly difficult to sustain, though, of course, judging by some of the responses and the people gathered in the Zoom call, I suspect the debate, of course, is far from over. Second, the book displays exemplary exegetical work in its treatment of textual dependence among the epistles. There is much to commend here. The verbal analysis, careful attention to imitation, engagement with Greco-Roman literary practices, and sensitivity to pseudegraphic conventions. In fact, I used part of this section in my own class on Monday to show an example of what rigorous comparative textual analysis in New Testament and Johannine studies can look like and should look like. Third, one of my favorite aspects of the book is the way Mendez builds bridges between Johannine scholarship and broader discussion in ancient literary culture, particularly practices of pseudo-historical and quasi-biographical letter writing. With considerable skill, Hugo asks how we might classify and describe the Johannine epistles if they were understood as the work of later literary imitators. Again, whether or not one ultimately is convinced, scholars and students working on Johannine literature will necessarily have to grapple with the careful and sustained analysis of both the similarities and divergences among the Johannine works that are presented in this book. And to use some of the language that Chris used, I agree. I think into the future, this is one of those books that students will and scholars will have to engage with, if anything, because of the detailed original and courageous reprisal of Johannine epistles will forever change how we read these texts, end quote. The work, of course, now awaits the next stage of scholarly interaction, responses that either challenge, refine, or further develop Mendez's accounts of the Johannine epistles as he has engaged with them. In the spirit of constructive engagement, let me offer 4 inquiries. First, regarding the reception history of these texts, I found myself wondering how much weight should be placed on differences in early reception as evidence for differing dates and historical settings. That the reception histories of the Johannine epistles are not identical is, of course, beyond dispute, as Mendez helpfully draws attention to those differences. Yet I wonder whether alternative or perhaps even complementary explanations remain possible. Yes, some early interpreters expressed hesitation regarding the authenticity of 2 and 3 John, but, and here I admittedly, with a degree of speculation, could relative silence or uneven reception simply reflect the limited circulation of these shorter texts rather than necessarily imply substantively later origins? Or put differently, does differing reception necessarily entail differing provenance, setting, or date? Second, I repeatedly found myself returning to the striking theological and conceptual coherence across the Johannine writings. And this is, of course, a common theme: duality, mutual indwelling, love, relies eschatology, Christology. And Hugo argues that the appearance of these themes in the epistles reflects, of course, later authors' attempts to sound authentically Johannine and thereby secure reception under the authority of previous authorships. But if these writings were indeed product of 3 unrelated, different, very different authors separated across time, I'll be curious, and here I don't know if there's an easy answer. I would just love your thoughts. Why these themes in particular, and not other themes? So one might imagine imitators drawing more heavily on motives, on other motives, for example. We could think about the logos at the beginning of John, or the Gospel's presentation as Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish institutions and festivals. To be sure, Mendez offers a compelling contextual explanation for certain emphases. For example, that 1 John's concern with sin after baptism naturally foregrounds the light-darkness dualism. Still, I remain curious whether there might be another, perhaps complementary explanation for why some Johannine themes became defining markers of imitation, while others recede almost entirely out of view. And here I was thinking, gosh, if I were to attempt to compose a text that would be received as authentically Johannine, what themes would I have chosen? And I suspect I would have maybe leaned heavier on maybe other themes. Third, and perhaps more technically, on the chapter that Cambridge, as has been announced, is putting out to read, and there's a link in the chat, chapter 5, on 1 John, on the audience as being regarded as brothers, namely regular participants within the assemblies and those that have been born of God and therefore experience this new life, sinless life. And while the discussion of the term little children, I find it especially illuminating, I was wondering about the other familiar or social designations within the letter, such as fathers and young people? Do these titles suggest further gradations and layers within the community beyond the two primary categories proposed? And what about the outsiders? Are non-members or peripheral attendees also being addressed in some fashion? Or more broadly, how porous do you think these categories can be? And what point does one move from one to the other? You mentioned from brothers to being born of God. What about potentially the other categories? And finally, I would be interested to hear more about the canonical implications of this project as you see them, Hugo. So much of the book operates understandably at the level of historical and literary reconstruction, but what about the implications of this model to the way that we read these texts together? I was wondering, coming from more of a Pauline area, whether this approach will help guide the Johannine scholarship in a trajectory that might follow some of the Pauline scholarship trajectories, in which we notice differences within the received Pauline texts. We perceive that these are authors trying to sound like and operate within the space of Pauline theology, and then a scholarship eventually moves to bring them back together and read them together. And so I wonder whether you envision some of that happening with Johannine literature as well. Again, whether or not one accepts Mendez's conclusion, this book succeeds in what the best of scholarship does. It destabilizes the modern assumptions in scholarship, reopens neglected questions, and compels the field to sharpen its methods. To borrow Canada Moss's language once more, Johannine scholarship will not look quite the same after this work. Thanks again, everyone, and thanks. Well done, Hugo.
Alberto, thank you so much. Again, another praise for a great book and also some really interesting questions that I think are going to stir a great conversation after the break. Congratulations, Hugo. I think you have some great colleagues here that know their stuff and have given your book some great praise, which it so really deserves. I have it 11:02 on my clock, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. So we'll start back up at 11:07, and Hugo will have the opportunity to respond to the panel at that time. So we'll see you at 11:07. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody, to CBA's Unbound Book Review on the Epistles of John by Hugo Mendez. So we are now going to give Hugo the opportunity to take some time to respond to the panelists, and then we will open up for a broader discussion, including our panelists and also our attendees out there in the virtual world. So Hugo, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Also, thank you, Chris, Sherri, Alberto, for really wonderful responses. I'm really honored, really humbled by them. And I now have the very unenviable task of trying to, put together at least my thoughts on so many of the issues that you all have raised. I'm not even sure exactly how to put these in order, but I at least noted, for Chris and Sherri having certain things in common, I think I can combine some people. So I'll try to move sort of through a series of issues rather than through a series of responses. So let me start by talking about this issue of nomenclature. I'm gonna start there, and that's one that Sherri raised. Sherri talked a little bit about the limitations that I see in the term pseudepigraphy when we deal with this literature. One very important one that I also draw out in the book is when we use the term pseudepigraphy, as long as it's actually been used, it's been used for both texts that disguise their authors, but also wrongly attributed texts. And that's really difficult then it's somewhat confusing then to apply that term to the Epistles of John, which of course have undergone in many ways both processes, I think. By my view of them, they are both texts that concealed their true authorship, but they are also texts that over history became misattributed to a specific figure, John, the son of Zebedee. For various reasons in the book, I tried to shy away from pseudepigraphy. And yet it is the standard word in our field for a reason. And so, the gravitational pull very much affects me. You can see it, I think, very directly in how I structured that presentation in the beginning around the word pseudepigraphy, because I think it is the most legible in our field. Sherri, you're absolutely right that I set up disguised authorship as a category, and it kind of falls away across the manuscript a little bit. It does so for one very specific reason I couldn't quite get over, which was, how do I turn it into something adjectival? So disguisedly authored texts was really clunky. And so I use disguised authorship, I think, in almost every chapter, but it's not one that I can use with great frequency because there's just one too many syllables for the kind of clear, lucid writing that apparently everyone really wants in the book, liked in the book. Sherri, you mentioned fake, and what I mean precisely is I use the term occasionally by the Yale classicist Irini Perano of literary fake. So this is a term that has circulation in some segments of classics by my colleagues in classics at UNC. The problem, of course, is, as is often the case with a lot of these terms, fake feels ethically charged in ways that are problematic and in ways that I don't want to sign on the bottom line for. And so I can find a usefulness for that term, but it's one that I feel some reticence in deploying regularly. And of course, I shied away almost completely from the term forgery, which my colleague Bart Ehrman at UNC prefers, but which also has its very problematic connotations, even though it's the one that my colleagues in medieval studies and art history would recognize more readily. Yeah, folks, the big picture here is that our nomenclature is just a little complicated when it comes to practices in which authors conceal their identities and impersonate inhabit personas, let's say. And I think my book has to walk that razor's edge, and I think the soles of my feet end up getting cut up a little bit in trying to carry that through. So I'll leave that as my comments on nomenclature. And folks, I really hope one day we could kind of figure this one out. I don't know how quite to figure this out. Chris and Sherri know I've been working for the last 10 years on trying to figure this out. In terms of connection, which is something that both Chris and Sherri raised, both of you all raised this question of how do we think about the idea that these authors are unconnected. And I wrote down the specific phrases you use. Chris, you found it, for instance, unlikely that these authors would have zero connection to each other or that they're completely independent of one another. And Sherri, you made very similar kinds of observations. Let me just say, I agree in that I definitely would never sign my name to these authors have zero connection or complete independence from one another. What I would say is that they are literarily connected, but potentially not socially connected. That's I think the difference that I'm really drawing in the book. So these authors are definitely connected if we mean that they have read the same literature, if we mean that they're engaging the same texts or the same emerging flowering corpus. I mean, they're very obviously connected in all the ways that we would imagine ancient writers who are, encountering works in circulation, and then in this case, imitating, borrowing language from those works. That's a definite route of connection. That's the way in which we still to this day can be connected and are connected to these texts, right? We are consumers of the Gospel of John, and it shows up in our religious vocabulary. Every time someone claims to be born again, or every time they believe the greatest commandment is love, they are showing the deep literary connection that exists with the ancient author of the Gospel of John. Social connection, though, I think is where I'm really trying to create space for possibilities beyond. They all necessarily came from, let's say, the same network of house churches that must have been concentrated around the city of Ephesus. I leave space in the book here and really press the argument that we can imagine that the author of, for instance, Third is writing in Alexandria, but is someone who has read the Gospel of John, a gospel that might have been produced in Ephesus or in Palestine. And this author then is literarily connected, maybe by several degrees socially connected, but not necessarily someone who ever directly interfaced, related with the author of the text. So maybe to your point, yes, I'm absolutely would never say zero connection. I would just attenuate that, clarify that what I mean is they're literarily connected, but perhaps not directly socially connected in the ways that, for instance, I think Martin and Brown were more likely to suggest, a generation ago. And I say this, of course, recognizing, and I think I always have to do this absolutely as passionately as I can. In challenging the views of these figures, I recognize, I mean, Raymond Brown was absolutely incredible. And if, the imagination, the incredible close exegetical work he brought into our field is something that I absolutely have the deepest reverence for. And, in challenging it, I think there's, as with all of you, no greater respect you can show to a work than to really grapple with it, really wrestle with it. Okay, separately, I will note, though, that the way that we're connected to the Gospel of John, of course, is in something of a more synthetic mode. We inherit the Gospel of John, but we also synthesize it with language from the Synoptics, with language from Paul. And that's a way in which I think we perhaps somewhat differ a bit from the authors of the epistles, who are very much trying to inhabit the authorial identity of the gospel writer. And in that respect, I think they're at least working towards a pure Johannine sort of language. They're a little more constrained in how far they're letting their vocabulary reach. That's not to say that we don't find things in the epistles that don't answer to the language of the gospel, whether it's atonement language or parousia language that, as I argue in this text, probably reflect engagements with Paul's writings or engagements with the synoptics. But it does mean that they were trying a certain kind of exercise to really inhabit the voice of that disciple. And in that respect, they remind me of, and here I'm going to kind of work with Sherri. You spoke about classroom activities. Every single year in my New Testament intro, I have my students do an activity in which they have to compose 4th John. They have to sit down and, if you will, craft pseudepigraphically the next installment of 9 epistles. And of course, what happens is, they might lace a little bit of their own Southern Baptist or United Methodist kind of language into that text. But there's definitely a strong desire to imitate as closely as possible existing Johannine expressions. And that definitely is borne out in their text. So that's kind of how I see the epistles working. I hope y'all are doing okay. Next up, Chris, you raised the question of the payoff of forging 2nd and 3rd John. The one thing that I really try to, a point that I really try to make in the book, and this is definitely the focus of chapter 6, if anybody wants to engage that chapter more closely. I argue that 2nd and 3rd John seem like texts that would be unusual to craft pseudepigraphically. They're very brief. They're very mundane. They seem very anchored in the day of a life of a single individual. And yet, one of the things that I note is that we have hundreds of very brief, very mundane, very quotidian kinds of epistles that survive from the ancient world that we know were pseudepigraphal. And this is where I draw especially on the work of my UNC colleague, Patricia Rosenmeyer, who has explored the vast field of Greek pseudo-historical letter writing. I note, for instance, in the book on page 157, I cite just a few of these epistles. I'll read one. This is a text that's 30 words long in Greek. It's much, much shorter than 2nd and 3rd John. To Cleophon and Gaius, the business you wrote about has already been attended to in part, and the remainder shall be attended to presently. For I, Lemnian that I am, count Imbros also as my fatherland, and with goodwill I am binding the islands to one another and myself to both. You find these kinds of texts often in literary collections, but they're texts that are 30 words apiece, less than 100 words apiece. They're all over Greek pseudo-historical letter writing. They do different kinds of work. They sometimes do quasi-biographical work. They're sometimes the stage for, kind of minor contributions, whether it's supporting another kind of pseudepigraphal text or introducing small messages of their own. One of the projects that I do in the book is to really suggest that 2nd and 3rd John fits snugly into this field of writing, and that they're very comparable to these other texts that were also written in the same time period. And so maybe to kind of get to another one of Chris's questions of, what's the benefit of looking at, for instance, Greco-Roman compositional practices rather than Jewish ones? I mean, I certainly hope that I'm not putting these two fields in an either or. I view Jewish writing in this period as yet another stream and expression of Greco-Roman compositional practices. Jews are participating in the ancient world in Greco-Roman composition broadly, especially in Greek. But I do think that when we look beyond some of the Jewish literature that we're very used to seeing, for instance, in the traditional category of pseudepigrapha, Old Testament pseudepigrapha that we're looking at, or when we look beyond certain New Testament pseudepigrapha, texts that tend to be, for instance, in the New Testament, very polemically inflected, that tend to be longer and more developed theologically. When we open it up to include the up to 1,700 Greek pseudo-historical letters that exist outside the New Testament that our colleagues in class are reading, I think we can receive a wider set of coordinates to map 2nd and 3rd John onto. Alberto, you raised a number of really important issues, and I'd love to, kind of work through all of them closely. You mentioned, for instance, the canonical implications of this project, and what does it mean then to think about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John the way that I'm doing, and then how do we think about putting that together in our own, for instance, Catholic or broadly Christian reading of the canon? We're all shaped by our institutional contexts. I teach at a secular public university, and that means that I think my research is shaped by a different kind of program for promotion, for legibility to my colleagues than it would be if I taught in a Catholic theological space. I am Catholic. I'm Greek Byzantine Catholic, and so those issues often really percolate to the surface of in my, and even if they don't always in my writing. In my case, I think that I have a conceptual distinction between what the authors of the epistles might have been doing on their own level and what, more broadly, the church can and should be doing with these texts. I even see the potential for authors who might be engaged in one project that would not necessarily completely match what the church can and should do with the same texts, the same language, the same expressions. The kind of analogy that I use with my students, and this is not the last time I'll ever use this, is I think about Caiaphas in the Gospel of John. Let's keep it Johannine. Caiaphas in chapter 11 of John, under the inspiration of the Spirit, because he was high priest that year, says that it is better for one man to die than that the nation should perish. And the author of John earmarks this as something that is roughly an inspired utterance because of his high priesthood. Caiaphas means one thing by this. He means let's kill Jesus. And everyone understands him in that way, that we should kill Jesus so that the Jewish nation survives an inevitable Roman retribution. But the author reads this on a different level. On, if you will, to kind of take a Ratzingerian expression, a pneumatological level. He reads it on a canonical level, if you will, to say instead that Jesus should die for the salvation of the nation in a really spiritual sense, that he should die for the salvation of the world, a meaning that Caiaphas never intended. The way that I, as a Catholic, tend to work with these texts is I understand that their authors might have been engaged in certain projects on a certain level, but I believe that the church has a responsibility and a calling to read the deeper pneumatological, canonical meanings of these texts, ones that will then help us see them in the broader context of Scripture, or in this case, the Johannine literature. For the most part, most of the Johannine texts actually work very neatly with one another, in part because they borrow so much language. I think they kind of piece together very neatly, where they might have subtle tensions between them. As I know, First John kind of runs on a little bit of a different current, I think, than some of the other texts. I think there's space for the church to read instead the same language in a different sense and to recognize a different intention on behalf of the divine author. I'll do one last one, again, for interest of time. Alberto, you raised kind of the thought exercise of why these themes in particular? Why do certain expressions rise to the surface of Johannine speech where other sorts of concerns we find in the gospel, why don't they tend to appear in the epistle? I think that's just a fascinating question. I think that's the kind of stuff that I hope my book really inspires. In laying out this kind of possibility that the epistles might be later pseudepigrapha derived from the gospel, the what question, if you will. My hope is that it becomes the stage for all sorts of why questions. Why were these choices made by the author of 2nd John? Certainly there's some level at which any author trying to fit something onto a sheet of papyrus, as we imagine 2nd and 3rd John, by their size, are roughly trying to do, are going to only be able to sample certain expressions. But that question of why this and not that, or why take this expression and adapt it the way that it does, I think that's the basis for new sorts of master's theses, doctoral dissertations. I think that's the stage for all kinds of new articles and books. My hope is that I've written something that can be really generative, predictive for the next generations of thesis.
Thank you, Hugo. I want to give the panelists just a brief moment if they feel they need to respond to something Hugo commented on. And then we have a comment from a few of our attendees that Josh is going to read out and then bring a couple of people on screen for us. But if the panelists have anything they'd like to respond to, you have just very briefly though, please, if you do.
I'll just say I appreciate, Hugo, your engagement with our comments and your responses. And nomenclature seems like something that we can work on at any and all future conference receptions. So let's do that.
Thank you.
And Hugo, Chris, Alberto, anything?
I'm happy to pivot to outside questions. Enough time.
Okay. All right.
Thanks,
Happy to
Hugo.
do that as well.
You synthesized a great deal of material in it over a 7-minute break, so we appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah, well done.
Josh, I'll hand it to you to read Bob's comment, and then I think bring on Libby, and then there's a couple more questions that popped up since then. So
Yeah. I'm going to read a comment from Bob Costello, and please forgive me, my internet appears to be a little unstable today. So if I blink out, I'll be right back. But the question from Bob reads, Hugo, as you develop the thesis that these three epistles are from different disconnected authors from different communities rather than a single community, did it lead you to question whether the fourth gospel derived from more than a single Johannine community, possibly helping to explain some of the source critical theories about the gospel?
Question, Bob. That's a great one. So, um, I my view of the gospel is traced out more thoroughly in my book, the Gospel of John, A New History. If you really want to, in the first chapter, sense of how I think about the gospel. I stand in what I kind of see as something like what's become the majority view of scholars today, although that's, counting majorities is a really difficult exercise, as we know. Um, but from my perspective, I think the Gospel of John is mostly the work of one author, with the possible exception of obviously the Principia Adulterae, but then also chapter 21. I'm still dragging my feet on thinking about chapter 21 as an original part of the Gospel. There are definitely aporie, skips, scenes, gaps in the gospel that historically have framed the kind of work of, Fortna in suggesting different layers to the gospel, or von Walde, obviously in more recent decades. Um, I think many Johannine scholars today tend to shy away from these sorts of more elaborate constructions of, sort of Johannine sources. Uh, and the reason I think is that even though these aporie exist, they are, in my view, not necessarily the aporie that lend themselves towards the view of multi-generational development from incremental source expansion, or things like that. They can just as easily be explained by a single author who, for one reason or another, over a long extended compositional process, might be missing a gap or two, might have arranged or rearranged material in a way that later created a skip or seam somewhere. I say this as someone who has just in the past year published 2 books that have their own aporie when one looks very closely. For me, what's significant about the aporie in the Gospel of John is that they don't always lend themselves towards very clear, I think, different kinds of boundaries of sources. So yes, for instance, at the end of chapter 14, Jesus says, I have much to say to you. I, will not necessarily be saying a lot to you now. The betrayer's coming, kind of a thing. And then he keeps talking for another few chapters. This is sort of a classic place where people see potentially material added later. What I would note is, the material on both sides of that verse is actually very similar and coherent theologically, which is, I think, one of the reasons why people have had such a hard time trying to draw boundaries around individual sources, why we have so many competing theories and no consensus as to what those sources could look like. So for that reason, I tend to think it's just as plausible that you have an author here who has introduced this line, and then in a of that verse in the way that perhaps scholars pick up on today. So to answer then your question, I don't necessarily need a text that evolved over still be one author who's still anchored in some community. I am reluctant to call that particular group that this author is participating in necessarily a Johannine community, in the sense of Christians who were lockstep with the author's thought. I think we can imagine an author who was embedded in some sort of, for instance, Christian group that thought exactly the way that he did, that use the same kind of language as he did completely. I also think that that group might have used some of the language that he did, and that this author was innovating on some level. I think that this author could have also found himself in a particular community setting that perhaps he had some tensions and pushbacks with from his own formation in yet another location. But I think he's anchored somewhere, and I think that he has synthesized influences at hand in his local setting, literature he's read, things he's inherited potentially from other settings, and brought together this incredibly rich text that then authors in subsequent decades are imitating and extending further.
Sorry. Thank you, Hugo. I'm just looking at the chat and there's just so many questions popping up here. I believe we're going to bring uh,
Elizabeth?
screen. Elizabeth, but yes. Well, she goes
Morning.
Morning.
Thanks, Hugo. So I'm really curious, especially with your comment about to Cleophon and Gaius about, these pseudepigraphical short letters that are written. I'm wondering if you've engaged at all with Lincoln Blumel's new book, Lady Eclectae, which came out the same year as your book. So I understand if you didn't have like a heads up on it. But
Yeah.
he argues that Second John is actually addressed to the Lady Eclectae. He thinks that there's a haplography where it's supposed to read eclecte te Kyria rather than eclecte Kyria. So he just thinks that the tau eta from like the article was dropped because te was written twice. And so he thinks that it's actually addressed to eclecte te Kyria, the Lady Eclecte. And in that case, then we have a named woman as the addressee. And he actually gives several Greek minuscules where the name is there. I should say the extra article is there. And also Clement of Alexandria seems to have assumed that it was written to the Lady Eclecte. Possibly Clement's second century copy had that definite article in it. And I'm curious if this helps your argument or if it nuances your argument as to whether Second John, if it's a forgery, or however you would refer to it as, if you would think that strengthens your argument or if it changes it at all.
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, the addition of Libby truly makes this now a complete Johannine community, I think, somewhere. Because remember, the Johannine communities were, after all, the friends we made along the way. Yeah, in terms of Blumel's book, I have not yet read the book in its entirety. I had a chance to kind of go through it, but I have not yet digested it. I certainly didn't have time to digest it before the book came out. I was not aware of its existence essentially until the book came out. In terms of how I would think about, the evidence that I have gone over, and especially the most critical chapter, and I forget what chapter it is now, demonstrates for me the greater plausibility of reading the lady elect, as being the actual addressee of this text. And Libby, you're the textual critic, so you can definitely tell me how plausible or not you find that reading in terms of the kind of manuscript support it has. I think other people that I've talked to in the textual critical world would note that some of the manuscripts that are being brought to the surface would not necessarily be the most probative for an alternative reading, but there is a Christian tradition behind viewing, a specific named woman as the addressee of Second John. Personally, I don't think that particular view needs to compete with any thesis that I provide in the book. I think it can sit complementarily for those who would like it to. It might make me adjust a few lines of the text where I do argue for the kind of more mainstream, the mainstream view that would view instead, the elect lady as being a cipher for individual Christian churches. There are still reasons why I like that particular view in terms of the internal exegesis of the letter, and also in terms of the potential sources I think might be behind the letter in terms of kind of the broader project of source criticism I'm doing here. Because I think of the Johannine epistles as second century pseudepigrapha, I am much more open to the idea that they actually know the Petrine literature and are inheriting their language of elder, their notion of sister church that is elect in Babylon, for instance, as a kind of influence on Second John. So, for those who feel very strongly about Bloomel's thesis, I don't necessarily in your way. There are reasons why I tend to be more reserved. Yeah.
Thank you.
Josh, you want to pick up on Stephanie's?
Yeah, I'm
question?
going to read two comments, Hugo, one from Stephanie Sonier and then one from AJ Levine. Stephanie writes, from the perspective of your approach, how would you interpret the relationship between John and First John on their potentially distinct understanding of hamartia and their potentially distinct focus on atonement, especially in relation to hamartia? And AJ's comment is as follows. Hugo, would you care to speculate on how your conclusions on the gospel and the epistles might impact understandings of Revelation?
Yeah, those are great questions. I'll take the first one. So briefly, in terms of how, in my view, would I interpret the relationship between John on their potentially distinct understanding of hamartia? I very much understand First John as being a text that is trying to address a question that the Gospel of John doesn't fully address very directly. The Gospel of John talks about the idea that individuals can receive the Spirit, and through that they can receive a new birth, a birth from above. And that through that they can experience an indwelling presence of God and they can indwell Christ. The thing that the Gospel of John, I think, doesn't address very directly for us is how does one know that they have obtained this experience? And for that matter, how does this relate to the human capacity for sin? We know that in the landscape of first century Jewish thinking, there were people who believed in a eschatological coming of the Spirit with the, final appearance of the Messiah, who would receive new natures that were beyond sin. We still anticipate this, for instance, as Christians for Christ's second coming, where we are, if you will, neutered for our capacity to sin any longer. I think that the author of First John is someone who has read the Gospel of John and who really wants to touch on this question that the Gospel of John hasn't touched. How do we integrate sin into our understanding of the new birth? Is there a place for sinlessness in our understanding of the new birth? So I would say that, at least for the author of First John, there was an attempt to supplement the Gospel's teaching on something that author felt was missing. In terms of First John's distinct focus on atonement, especially in relation to hamartia, I think in the book, I argue in the book, that this probably reflects the introduction of language of atonement. I think reflects the author of First John being someone who is synthesizing the Gospel of John and its language and its thought with other streams of Pauline, post-Pauline. I argue for a Pauline contribution to First John literarily by an author who either knows this literature that we have today directly, or at least is shaped in contexts that have been shaped by the thought of Paul. And I think that's where we're seeing some of that language being brought together with things we find in the Johannine tradition, just the way that Valentinians, that Proto-Catholics, that Sethians in the second century are drawing together the language and categories of the Gospel of John with synoptic categories, Pauline categories, or if you will, Stoic categories, and all sorts of other fields of influence in the way that we still do that today. I hope that helps. In terms of AJ's question, hi AJ, would you care to speculate how your conclusions on the Gospel and Epistles might impact understandings of Revelation? So that really is the next question in my scholarship. My next project, I'm under contract with Oxford for a new commentary on the Book of Revelation, in which I will very much be trying to do something that, not every Johannine scholar does, which is to try to, kind of relink some of the texts that classically fall under the mantle of Johannine literature, but that, have become two different subfields, two different silos in New Testament studies, and for good reason. I threw out the possibility at the end of the Gospel of John, A New History, that Revelation might be a part of this flourishing tradition of writing in the persona of the eyewitness author of the Gospel of John, albeit under the name John specifically. Something that we already see in other works like the Apocryphon of John, from the Sethian Gnostic tradition, or, for instance, the Epistula Apostolorum, some of these apocryphal apocalypses of John. That is a possibility that I throw out. It's kind of my last hand grenade, duck and cover at the end of my book of maybe we need to reopen the relationship between John and Revelation, and we'll see how I feel about it over the next decade. But I think that the work that I'm doing to how we configure the Gospel and Epistles of John to one another definitely leaves room for how we might reconfigure the relationship of Revelation with these other texts. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you, Hugo. I think we now have Fernando. Is that right, Josh? Or we actually have a
Felipe has joined us on screen.
Oh, right. Felipe is next. Sorry, Felipe.
Okay. Well, Hugo, thank you so much for your contribution. I just posted the question in the chat as well in terms of redaction. That is the point basically of my question. Just a little bit of background. My focus is on Pauline literature, and I'm working now in the pastoral letters, especially the association First, Second Timothy, and Titus, in terms of both authorship and redaction, the possibility. So, following your own contribution here, what is the role of redaction? Not only 1, 2, 3 Johns, but possibly also even in the gospel as well. Do you see any work of redaction in the gospel, like stages, 2, 3 possible stages in the gospel, and then in the letters of John? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Felipe. Our Johannine community grows on screen. I'm enjoying this. In terms of, so again, I kind of noted earlier, I am, like a lot of scholars today, a bit more skeptical of our ability to really reconstruct definitively multiple stages to the gospel in its development, and even underlying sources. I mean, the Gospel of John undoubtedly has underlying sources of some kind. And we can begin very strictly with the synoptic gospels, because I do subscribe to the more recent scholarship of Mark Goodacre, of James Barker, of Wendy North, and really kind of calling attention to places where the Gospel of John seems to know and be adapting the synoptic tradition. So we can start by talking about those as sources for the gospel. Whether there's some core material, the kind of classic sign source for the gospel, I'm a bit more skeptical of that due to our limited ability to reconstruct that kind of document. But I do think that the Gospel of John, based on an analogy to how we see the Gospel of John using the synoptics, may very well have other Jesus traditions, written or oral, available to it, that it is adapting and reconfiguring in the gospel. In terms of, kind of redactional layers in the gospel, again, I have a little more reticence, although I can't either completely rule it out. I just tend to think this is more likely one author. If I'm understanding, the one exception that I would give, of course, and I said this earlier, is chapter 21, where chapter 21 for me still feels like a secondary addition to the gospel, partly because it's the one place in the gospel where we get a nice clean aporia that also lines up with other sorts of discontinuities, right? We're not going to narrate more miracles, but we are going to narrate more miracles. We're going to imbue the disciples with the Spirit, but they are going to go on a fishing trip somehow. The need for kind of redundant endings at the end of both. There's a kind of convergence of features that still makes chapter 21 interesting. And maybe that helps me then answer your question. It strikes me that I think 3rd John is dependent in part on the Gospel of John, that it is imitating the language of the Gospel of John. One of the places where I see it is where 3rd John makes this kind of affidavit, we testify to him also, and our testimony is true. And what's interesting to me is that the closest analog for that language is not 1935 in the Gospel of John, as important as that analog is. For me, it's actually 2124. That is just a little closer to the language we find in 3rd John, which would suggest to me that the author of 3rd John may know a copy of the Gospel of John that has chapter 21, assuming we can say it's secondary, which is always going to be contested due to lack of manuscript evidence for that. In that case, then we could think about 3rd John as potentially, big asterisks floating all around, knowing a version of the Gospel of John that perhaps other epistle writers didn't. That's a possibility. I'll say on one final note, I don't, though, tend to subscribe to the kind of view that you see, for instance, Paul Anderson throw out that the single author of the epistles also happened to be an editor of the Gospel of John. I think the same kind of data that Paul is looking at to say that the author of the epistles is an editor of the gospel, I think lends itself more cleanly towards the epistles simply know the gospel and are literarily dependent on it. So that may be just one big way of kind of gesturing to a lot of different issues, but hopefully in a way that answers your really excellent question.
Felipe, thank you for that question. Hugo, great answer. We have, I believe, time for a question from Fernando and then a comment from James. So Fernando, it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask it to Dr. Mendez. And I would like to ask about the one topic on the chapter 5 in the book regarding like the believing that Jesus is the Christ, And I I was really interested to better understand the theme of the Antichrists in the Epistles of John, because this is the theme that appears only there, only in the letters and not in the Gospel. So I would like, as we have this proposal that the language of the letters are imitating the Gospel of John. So why do we have only the topic of the Antichrists in the Epistles of John? Thank you, Dr. Mendez.
Yeah. That's a fantastic question, and of course, because when we think of 1st John and 2nd John, we especially think of the Antichrists as their distinctive contribution to something we might construct as the Johannine tradition. Although, I think the Johannine tradition is really this kind of at least thing we sort of project off of the literature. That's another kind of story. So how do the Antichrists fit into this? So first of all, or where are the Antichrists coming from? How are we picking up this particular language? So again, the chapter that's available online for free right now with Cambridge, again, chapter 5, has my full and complete discussion of it. And like a lot of scholars, it says it way better than I ever could. And my book tends to know more than I do over time. That's the nature of all scholarship. So I would definitely, refer you to that discussion if you want the most kind of intense engagement with this. But in the book, I argue that the Antichrists should fundamentally be understood as a literary rhetorical construct. It does correspond to some real set of people that the author of 1st John knows or has understood. I argue, for instance, in the book that he's fundamentally probably thinking of people who are apostates from a proper, if you will, Christian confession, or people who have some defective Christian confession. I think the ambiguity in the text is an ambiguity that lets us see this in kind of a broad category, as a broad category. But I think the Antichrist is this umbrella term for people that he believes have fallen short of belief in Jesus in the terms that he sets out as important. And maybe that involves apostates from Christianity, people who had some sort of Christ belief and became Jewish, or, people who had some Christ belief and fell into some other Christ belief he found effective. I think that's going to be another question. In terms of the language of antichrists, I think that the language in the book, I argue that it may very well be a synoptic inheritance of sorts. He suggests that this is a term that they have heard. That's the expression he uses, as you have heard. And elsewhere in 1 John, he uses that expression, you have heard, to refer to traditions that Jesus gave, especially those that are represented in the Gospel of John. So, for instance, he says the new commandment is one you have heard. Well, you very well might have heard that, especially reading 1 John from the Gospel of John. I think in this case, he might be thinking of the synoptic Gospels. It strikes me that the language of antichrists and false prophets, which is also used for these antichrists, seems to match, or at least align to some extent, with the language of false Christs and false prophets in the synoptic tradition that could be an influence for the author. In terms of why he has raised the point of the antichrists, I think that the antichrists play a role in his larger argumentation on sin and sinlessness. So one thing that definitely distinguishes me a bit from other scholars is I think historically scholars have tended to take the antichrists. They've worked around the assumption that if we're going to understand 1 John, we have to understand its social situation. And our best clue to its social situation is the appearance of these antichrists that went out from us. My view instead is that actually I think the Gospel's repeated emphasis on sin and sinlessness from the beginning to the end is really its most important thing, and that the antichrists fit within that argument. I think the antichrists represent a point within the author's argumentation, specifically that one can be a part of the visible community of believers and yet not actually be of that community. That even though you might attend a Christian gathering, a Christian association, you might not actually be born of God. And the proof is your eventual falling away from that community. And I think he holds this up in the text to say, people may claim that they're born of God. People may claim that they've received the Spirit, but their actions, specifically their manifestations of sin, prove that they don't actually belong to the community. And the antichrists represent this kind of catch-all category, even extreme example of what this looks like. So read chapter 5 for that complete argumentation, but that's my best attempt to try to put that all together for you. I hope that helps.
Yes, it helps. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great question, Fernando. Hugo, that was a great response to a very complicated question. So I think that's going to bring us to the end. It's 11:58. I hate to end this because there's still some questions in the chat. I think we probably could go on for another hour if anybody had any voice left, but I'm sure y'all can communicate by email. Hugo, I'm sure would be glad to communicate with you. Hugo, I want to thank you very much for writing such a great book. The comments and the communication discussion we had just shows you how welcome it is in the academy and how much of a valuable asset it's going to be in the future, like everyone has said. And I'm sure people are going to look forward to reading it, those who haven't. And remember that Cambridge is giving a 20% discount, and the code was in the chat earlier. Hopefully you got that. And thank you so much for our panelists today, for Chris, for Sherri, and Alberto, for taking the time to read it and put together your comments and your helpful thoughts to Hugo as he considers his work, and when he moves on to his commentary and revelation, I really look forward to that. That's going to be quite a piece of work. But thank you all for joining us today. I just have a few comments before we close out. For those of you out there in virtual land, if you are not a member of CBA, I would recommend that you go to the CBA CatholicBiblical.org website and go to the membership. I believe Josh has put that in the chat. Yes, he has. Josh is so good. Let's thank Josh for everything he's done today. He is so great at this stuff, man, and I would be lost without him. And everything that we do together, and the initiatives that we come up with, we work really great as a team, and it's such good to have him as a partner in crime. Is what we do with CBA. But anyway, also the AGM, if you are a member, registration deadline is June 19th at 11:59 for in-person participation, and then July 10th, 11:59 for virtual participation. That's at another Loyola University of Maryland in Baltimore. So please come out. It is a beautiful campus. We're really looking forward to it. We've had nothing but a great experience with the people there, and it's a beautiful campus. And thank you everybody for being here, especially those out there in virtual land, for taking the time out today. And for those of you who watched on Facebook, thank you for joining us. And Hugo, again, thank you for writing the book.